Hey everyone, Steven Donziger, the lead plaintiff's lawyer against Chevron in the long-running Chevron Ecuador case, and his compatriots have taken yet another hit. Because, hey, the case against Chevron in Ecuador is fraudulent. The bottom line is, a court in Gibraltar has ruled that Amazonia Recovery Limited, which is a kind of a James Bond-esque corporation that Steven Donziger and his legal team set up in Gibraltar to act as a holding company to take in monies they anticipated would be won in fraudulently suing Chevron for actions of Texaco in Ecuador between 1967 and 1992. Now, the Gibraltar court said, hey, look, you have to pay Chevron $28 million. And the reason for the ruling was, well, Amazonia didn't put up a defense. And on top of that, Amazonia has no assets to actually be claimed to pay Chevron. So this looks like something that Donziger and his team may have anticipated, and that's why they set the company up in Gibraltar rather than any place else. And they didn't set it up in Ecuador because they didn't want the Ecuadorian government to get its hands on the money that they expected to get, which is really an interesting item of new news for this reason. In 2009, Washington Penzance, the then, if not still, Attorney General for Ecuador, had said that should the court of Ecuador, and he expected the court of Ecuador to rule against Chevron, that the government would collect 90%, again, 90% of the winnings for its own purposes. Whereas the argument that Donziger used was, oh, we're going to take that money and give it to the indigenous people, which I always felt, and I said then, was a tall tale, a tall claim, because of Donziger's relationship with Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, and his family, and his hires. I say that because in Ecuador, corruption and money grabbing is common. Everyone is on the take. And so Donziger could not be involved with President Correa and his people without him being on the take with respect to them. Okay? And I'll get to that, a deeper explanation of what I just said there in one moment. Back to the main point and the present. So the suit went through. Chevron is owed $28 million, and this is how we got here. And this will wind back to the matter regarding Steven Donziger and his relationship with President Correa. While Texaco was involved in Ecuador, it partnered with the country of Ecuador and created a company called TexPen. Ecuador is the majority owner in TexPen. Okay? The majority owner. Bet you didn't know that. The share of the total corporate structure that was owned by Chevron, not Chevron, but Texaco. See, even I get into that because of the name Chevron thrown out so much. But the share of TexPen that was owned by Texaco dwindled to a point where by 1989, its portion, somewhere around 14%, and dwindling, was so little that no Texaco personnel was involved in oil production using TexPen that year. By 1992, Texaco had sold its interest entirely to Ecuador, and Petroecuador took over those fields that Texaco once owned and operated out of, but always in partnership with Ecuador. You see, it was supposed to be a kind of import replacing exercise. That is, Ecuador, which was involved in seeing its oil being extracted from its land and it retaining a small fee, wanted to get into the place of producing the oil, extracting and producing the oil, and selling it itself. Hence, an import replacing function. To that end, Ecuador essentially got its wish. Petroecuador became the owner of these lands. The popular idea is that Texaco was the only American oil company involved in Ecuador. Folks, not only that, the only world oil company involved in Ecuador. Folks, if you believe that, you believe that, well, there's Casper the Friendly Ghost and a lot of the other stuff that you're asked to believe. Like, I've got this swampland I want to sell you down here in Florida. And anyway, I digress. The reality is that American companies like Occidental Petroleum were involved in Ecuador until they were kicked out in 2007. And in the case of Texaco, when it went out, Chevron had no involvement at all in that production or in ownership of Texaco at that point. Chevron didn't own Texaco officially until 2001 and really took total control in 2005 of what was Texaco. And it inherited this issue. But in 1998, Texaco spent $40 million cleaning up its portion of the land in Ecuador that was used for oil production, and wrote a contract with the state of Ecuador, which basically said Texaco has taken care of its duties of cleaning up the land and can go on its way. And that's precisely what happened. Stephen Donziger, however, claimed that the oil and oil spills that were in the area were the responsibility of now Chevron, because he claimed that Texaco didn't finish its work. Stephen Donziger and his compatriots conveniently ignored the existence of Petroecuador and many hundreds of oil spills and hundreds of thousands of oil barrels spilled over a period of many years in that same area, in the same region. It was like it didn't occur. Never happened. Even as Petroecuador was responsible for many oil spills, harming many lives in the Amazon, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, excuse me. They just ignored it. You would say, why did they do this? Because Stephen Donziger needed to make a choice. He got in bed, if you will, with those who were representing the Ecuadorian political system, particularly President Correa, who was elected in 2006 as a powerfully leftist leader in Ecuador. He sought to nationalize Ecuador's oil production and had in Donziger a friend that he could basically use any way he wanted to. So it would have hurt Donziger's cause to turn around and then sue Petroecuador and make the president of Ecuador, who's supposed to be his ally, look bad, right? So Donziger basically had to do this. Oh, I don't see this, and oh, this doesn't exist. And act like and create a cover for president of Korea, of the president of Ecuador and Petroecuador to do its dirty deed. And meanwhile, they would collectively point at Chevron, even for actions that occurred and were obviously and noted by the media as being the responsibility of Petroecuador to this day, as recently as 5 years ago. You heard that correctly, folks. So it should come as no surprise to you that Chevron sued Stephen Donziger, and by extension his associates, like those who chose to be part of something called the Amazon Defense Coalition, under the charge of RICO, Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act. In March of 2014, New York U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan found that Donziger was guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and coercion in doing what he had done 3 years before the judgment in 2011, when an Ecuadorian court ruled in favor of Donziger and said that Chevron would have to pay $19 billion. And then they later halved that, roughly, to $9.5 billion. But the RICO judgment, which Donziger now is appealing, really damaged what Donziger was trying to do and revealed many aspects of his approach, his fraud. And the smoking gun was really a movie. It was called Crude. It was the outtakes from Crude, where Donziger was basically admitting that he was bribing judges and you know, hey, doing what Ecuadorians do, or, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? Well, Stephen Donziger followed that saying to a hilt, and it got him into trouble. So now, Donziger has successfully, somehow, managed to convince the Supreme Court in Canada to hear his case because Chevron has assets in Canada. The question is, how long can Donziger successfully advance this lie? I don't know. It's been going on for 20 years now. But the bottom line is this. You can't expect to win any legal case by structuring it on a card of lies. All you have to do is pull one of them, and all of them coming down. In Donziger's case, there were a number of consultants that later testified that they were told to lie with respect to findings of contamination and other data, and they admitted that in some cases data was falsified. Well, same thing as lying. There's a lot here that when it's put together, you would say, God, it's amazing Stephen Donziger is still practicing law, isn't it? But that's where we are right now, and that's as concise an explanation as you're going to get of where we are with the Chevron Ecuador situation to this point.